Hello, and welcome to ING's panel discussion on lessons learned post 9/11, strengthening community and building intercultural connections, allyship, and solidarity. I would like to thank all of our distinguished speakers representing diverse religious, racial, and ethnic communities for joining us today, each of whom I will introduce before I ask them to speak on the impact of 9/11 on their communities. I would also like to welcome all of those joining us from homes, offices, and classrooms across the nation. Prior to 9/11, there was limited interfaith work and engagement across religious communities in the US. Most people felt secure from the prospect of an attack on American soil. Many also felt confident about US standing in the world. Most of Generation Z were too young to remember 9/11. While Generation Alpha wasn't born yet. It is thus important for students to learn about the event and its impact on our communities. On September 11th, 2001, 2,996 people in New York, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania were killed by hijackers affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Americans of all religions, races, and ethnicities were tragically lost, as well as citizens of more than 90 other countries. Some of the heroic first responders to the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York were among those who died, and many who survived still suffer from chronic illnesses related to inhaling toxic dust from the destruction and debris left behind. Family members and friends of the victims, our nation and the world were left to mourn and try to make sense of these senseless acts of violence. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, two visions and responses emerged and crystallized. The first was driven by fear and xenophobia, and the second by love and solidarity. In addition to seeking justice against those behind the criminal attacks, some were collectively blamed and targeted because of their religion or appearance, including Muslim Americans and those perceived to be Muslim, such as Sikhs and Christian Arabs. We saw a dramatic rise in Islamophobic hate crimes and murders after 9/11, including attacks on Muslim women who wear the hijab or headscarf. There was also a rise in Islamophobic and white nationalist hate groups, the latter of which target not only Muslim Americans, but also Jewish, African, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian Americans. We witnessed the racialization of Muslims who were racially profiled and detained at airports. There was and continues to be a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment at the borders. In the years following 9/11, we saw the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, which have impacted Americans and immigrants alike. We also saw the passage of the Patriot Act, which expanded surveillance and curtailed the civil liberties of Muslims and all Americans. And yet there was and is another vision and response from many Americans. Many individuals and communities were driven by hope, love, and a desire to connect and build bridges. People from different religions and backgrounds came together to learn about each other. The interfaith movement grew with new participants and became a national and global movement. The anti-war movement reemerged and gave rise to progressive movements that address inequalities impacting various marginalized groups. There were peaceful protests across the nation and world against wars, especially the war on Iraq. There was also an outpouring of support from some Americans, particularly The panel of learned speakers today represent and embody the best impulses of America and humanity. Today, I am joined by community leaders and educators representing the Muslim American, Sikh American, Jewish American, Christian American, Hindu American, Japanese Buddhist American, African American, Latinx American, and Asian American communities. I am pleased to welcome our first panelist. Ameena Jandali is a Muslim American and content contributor at ING. Ameena, can you speak to the impact of 9/11 specifically on the Muslim American community?
Thank you, Zach, and thank you all for being here. So as we well know, the world changed for most Americans on 9/11, but for Muslim Americans, it was striking. My first response to 9/11, like most people, was shock and horror, immediately compounded by media reports that it was Muslims who were behind the attack. After the initial emotions over such a terrible attack was the feeling of fear and dread for what lay ahead, and the realization that everything had changed overnight for Muslims. I remember being glued for hours to the television, unable to do much else. My sister, who was visiting, told me to stay home for the next few weeks and actually went out and bought me a couple of hats to wear if I needed to go out. I did stay home for the first few days, but soon realized that life must go on, and so I went out without the hats. And while I didn't personally experience any hate in the first weeks following 9/11, we heard daily reports of women wearing hijab like me, having vitriol hurled at them, hearing about attacks on mosques and Muslim stores and violence against Muslims or those who looked like Muslims. Many Muslims and those who looked Muslim hung flags in their houses or store windows. And in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, hate crimes against Muslims grew from just 28 incidents in 2000 to 481 in 2001, according to FBI statistics. However, as we well know, many more go unreported, and in this case, because of the state of fear and suspicion, many were not reported. And we've seen hate crimes against Muslims decline in the years after 9/11, only to rise again in 2016, when political rhetoric against Muslims again demonized them, paving the way for the travel ban against mainly Muslim majority countries in 2017. For Muslim students, the effect of 9/11 was immediate and gut-wrenching, especially for girls wearing hijab. They were most impacted. They were already a target of teasing, but it became normalized and constant. One of the most common epithets till today against Muslim boys is being called a terrorist, called Osama, bomber, or having jokes made about having a bomb. Until today, polls about bullying find that Muslim students are bullied at twice the national average of regular students, impacting 40 to 50% of Muslim students. Probably the most dire impact of 9/11 was the assumption by both the public and the government that Muslims are automatically a suspect as a national security threat. This not only led to hate crimes, but many of the government policies which followed, such as wiretapping and other surveillance, including at the library. As Zach mentioned, shortly after 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act, which made it easier for law enforcement to monitor online and phone communications. Mosques, student groups, and even Muslim businesses were surveilled by the government or local police departments, as in the NYPD case. And then, of course, when the wars in Afghanistan and later Iraq were declared, this enmity and suspicion only increased. And the assumption was that one could not be both a Muslim and a patriotic American. The role of enemy became solidified, and anti-Muslim bigotry at home and abroad led to the vilification of the citizens of both of these countries, who were viewed as violent, subhuman, and backwards, with resultant atrocities such as those at Abu Ghraib and the deaths of thousands of innocent Iraqis and Afghans in destructive wars that have proven to have been a tragic waste of lives and trillions of dollars. Bigotry against Muslim Americans was magnified by the demonizing and stereotyping of Muslims in popular culture, including the media, where according to a media watchdog, 60 to 80% of coverage of Muslims is negative. Hollywood, another important player in popular culture, has long stereotyped Muslims, and after 9/11, kept on producing films featuring Muslims as the bad guys or terrorists. Video games are often set in settings resembling Iraq, and they cast Muslims and Arabs as bad guys and terrorists. And of course, the internet and social media, which are more recent, are filled with negative posts and even falsehoods about Muslims. In fact, Islamophobic groups have used the internet, social media, and online videos to spread anti-Muslim fears and conspiracy theories. These groups were funded to the tune of over $200 million, according to two reports called Fear Inc. and Fear Inc. 2.0. Their sole focus was to create an environment of fear and suspicion towards Muslims through well-organized campaigns beginning with the 2010 nationwide campaign against the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, which in reality is about or was about an Islamic center in Lower Manhattan. These campaigns not only fanned anti-Muslim sentiment, but led to the rise in anti-Muslim hate groups, which numbered at only 5 in 2010 to over 100 in 2016, again, in part to the political rhetoric of the 2016 election campaign. But all was not negative. In the months following 9/11, at ING, we were overwhelmed with requests for presentations about Muslims by people who had a desire to understand a previously little-known faith that was suddenly in the spotlight. Interfaith allies stood in solidarity with Muslims, guarding their mosques and businesses, sending flowers and cards, and even holding events where women wore hijab for a day. 20 years later, as we are battling other wars, the pandemic and the greater threat of climate change, which both have ravaged New York City recently on the eve, most recently of the anniversary, we have learned that hostility and wars do not solve problems, but create bigger problems, and that we are stronger and more united when we work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ameena, for telling the stories of Muslim Americans and the discrimination, both personal and systemic, that we faced. I think many people don't realize, many of our viewers may not realize, that other communities, other religious, racial, and ethnic communities in the United States were also impacted. And so that's why it's my pleasure to welcome our next panelist to speak on this. Gurwin Singh Ahuja is a Sikh American and co-founder of the National Sikh Campaign. Thank you so much for joining us. Gurwin, how did 9/11 specifically impact Sikh Americans?
Before I begin, Zach, I want to thank you and ING and the whole ING team for putting together such an inclusive conversation on this topic, because 9/11 was so impactful for so many different communities. So my hat's off to ING. And 9/11 was a very difficult time for the Sikh community, primarily because of our basically practice of wearing turbans and beards, which actually communicates a Sikh's commitment to equality and tolerance for all people, and to fight for equality and tolerance of all people, regardless if they're Sikh, was associated with terrorism, because there was every day images on the news of Osama bin Laden and Taliban and people wearing turbans and sporting beards and getting confused between these two things. And this led to, as Ameena had articulated, just a fury of hate crimes and a lot of panic within the community, because obviously we were grieving as Americans, but suddenly we have found ourselves at the ire of basically just hate. And it manifested itself in many different ways. And I can talk a little bit about myself, because when it happened, I was only 12 years old, but I was, as I remember, very aware of how it was impacting my day-to-day life, how it impacted people, that were older, in some ways that were incredibly tragic, in ways that we had tried to rectify this moving forward. So, just as myself, I remember only being 12 years old and knowing immediately within, a week or so, that when I would go to the grocery store with my mom, or when I would go to school, that students, teachers, classmates, strangers would all look at me differently and with a bit of panic. And as I got older, and I started taking flights and just being out in the world, I had to basically be very aware that people perceive me as a threat, and not just a threat that will commit a crime, but someone that is ready to commit mass murder on a moment's notice, which really required a lot of processing as a child. And that happened for the Sikh community and obviously for the Muslim community. And that was just me growing up. I mean, this had real ramifications for adults. There's a gentleman named Balbir Singh Sodhi. He was actually the first person to be killed in response to a hate crime in response to 9/11. And Balbir, I am very good friends with his brother, Rana uncle, and his Rana uncle, shares, Balbir was so distraught when 9/11 happened, and he wanted to go from Arizona to New York and be as helpful as possible. And he was trying to get flags, try to donate money, and he had a conversation with his brother on September 15th, 2001, to buy some American flags to put outside their house to show solidarity with the victims of the terrorist attack. And he then, after talking to his brother, went to go garden outside of his gas station, did some plants, and was gardening a few plants for his gas station. And he had a stellar reputation within the community, would often give free candy to children that would come to the gas station. And as he was gardening, a shooter came up and shot him because he thought he was a terrorist. And Balbir, as much as he was concerned about his country, his fellow citizens, fell prey to effectively ignorance. And again, that has played itself out for other communities as well. So it had very real ramifications, and which brings me to the action part. I think all of us in the Muslim community and beyond took an assessment of this situation and said, now what? And my internal now what, as a young man at that time, I made a very clear decision as a child, believe it or not, to not give in to the cynicism and the hatred and become bitter and to give up my faith. I had made that decision, and I think that decision was also made by the Sikh community at large, because we decided not only will it be important for us to articulate who we are to the American public, because clearly people do not know, but it is also very important for us to ensure that that finger then is not redirected at the Muslim community. So, I started National Sikh Campaign in large part because there was so much misunderstanding about Sikhs. Our number one thing is spreading awareness. And I'm very proud to have worked with Maha to do that on a larger scale for all faiths, primarily for my own motivation to ensure that this does not continue happening to the Muslim community either. Because the people that had carried out that attack that day have nothing to do with the other billion or so Muslim people on this earth that are peaceful, that are stand-up citizens, and are our neighbors and our friends. So moving forward, I think it's very important for us to continuously make the point that being an American is not about what you look like, it's what you believe in. If you believe in equality, if you believe in tolerance, you're an American. And I think that as we confront other challenges, as Ameena articulated, like climate change and obviously even this pandemic, it's very, very important to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gurwin, for sharing these tragic stories that have affected you personally and the Sikh community in general in the US. And also, I think, a story of one of triumph, of sort of transcending the hate and emerging with love. I'd next like to introduce Rabbi Melanie Aron, who is a Jewish American and serves Congregation Shir Hadash in Los Gatos, California. Thank you so much, Rabbi Melanie, for joining us. Can you also discuss how 9/11 affected the Jewish American community?
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to include a Jewish perspective. I'd say that fear and overwhelming sadness were what the Jewish community experienced on 9/11 and on the days that followed. Sadness as communities on the East Coast lost significant numbers of fathers and sons, brothers and sisters, friends and fellow congregants. New York City is the city with the densest Jewish population outside of Israel. 12% of New Yorkers were Jewish in 2001. And we shouldn't be surprised that 13% of those who died on that day were ultimately identified as coming from the Jewish community. Because many of these people had worked for the same companies and lived in the same suburban communities in New Jersey and Connecticut, commuting into lower Manhattan, whole neighborhoods were decimated by these losses. And later there were Jews in the United States military and Jewish victims from the unions who worked at Ground Zero. Immediately following 9/11, there was, of course, uncertainty. There were days of unrealistic hopes, but eventually the grappling with accepting death without a corpse or without certain proof, something which is problematic from the point of view of Jewish law. Rabbis from those communities were officiating at 4 or 5 funerals a day and still calling in other rabbis to help from outside the area and offer pastoral support. There was also a great deal of fear. Fear as Americans because of the attack and the initial concern that other attacks might follow, but also as Jews because false rumors began to spread almost immediately. Some said it was the Mossad. Some said Jews had been told to stay home, that Israelis had left the area, that Jews owned the World Trade Center and wanted to collect on the insurance. All of these conspiracy theories built on ancient motifs as Jews as manipulating, mercenary, controlling world events. Ironically, the conspiracies managed to bring together far-right American extremists and white supremacists, for whom Jews are the puppet masters of the world, with some elements from the Arab Muslim world, who are usually their enemies, but who are glad to buy into this hoax. An entire industry emerged, presenting the views that only Jews had the cunning to pull off such an attack. And this conspiracy group had books, speakers, videos, of course, and websites. It made no difference that Jeremy Glick, a Jewish judo and rugby player from Saddle River, New Jersey, had been part of that small group that joined Mark Bingham attacking the hijackers of Flight 93 and saving the United States Capitol. Factual accounts were of no interest to conspiracy theorists, whose views can't be disproved by evidence, as they always believe that they alone know the real story. In the months after 9/11, I got to know Mark Bingham's mother, Alice Hoagland, who lived in Los Gatos, and championed her gay son as she tried to teach acceptance of religious and racial diversity and the possibility of heroism in all people. Shortly after 9/11, a young woman who had grown up in our congregation and after college found an internship in Washington, D.C., called me panicked. She was afraid as a Jew to be walking on the streets with so much talk of conspiracies. And she was afraid because, having been born in Persia and Iran, she was fearful of being attacked for looking like an Arab. Maha El-Ghanidi of ING contacted me just a few days after the attack and invited me to the mosque in Santa Clara. A group of Christian clergy women joined me, all of us wearing hijabs that day in solidarity with our neighbors. We were warmly welcomed, and in the months immediately afterwards, some of the barriers which had existed came down to some extent, and a few visits and joint programs were organized. Perhaps that was the positive that we can focus on this evening, that the attack heightened our awareness of the necessity of interfaith community, of working together, of really getting to know each other. The colleagues who came with me to the Santa Clara Mosque continued this work in the decades following, building bridges among a variety of communities. Just to conclude, a great deal has happened in the last 20 years, but perhaps one recent event is symbolic of the changes that have taken place. Recently, there was an apology by Jonathan Greenblatt, who is now the head of the Anti-Defamation League, for the policy of his predecessor, Abe Foxman, who had objected to the building of the Cordoba House in the vicinity of the fallen towers. Greenblatt noted that the aims of the ADL are twofold: to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. We have come to learn that one cannot seek one without the other. Thank you so much.
Rabbi Melanie, we're so grateful for your learned voice and sharing the experiences and the tragedies, and also the unfounded conspiracies that the Jewish community has faced, but also returning that with solidarity with Muslim Americans. I think we have so much in common, and that's one of the things I hope all of us as speakers and panelists and everyone at home is discovering. I'd next like to turn to Reverend George McDonnell, who is a Christian American and Reverend at Ascension Episcopal Church in Stillwater, Minnesota. Thank you for joining us, Reverend George. Can you speak on how 9/11 impacted Christian Americans and what responses did we see?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here this evening. It is a pleasure to be with all of you, friends from ING. When 9/11 took place, I found myself far, far from home and feeling further away from New Jersey, where I grew up, and New York, which I love so much. I was in Scotland on an internship. A cousin of mine who worked at the Trade Center was missing for days afterwards. And we were fortunate that he was merely late to work that day and missed the bombing by minutes. I still remember the two responses I saw from people, both in the UK and in the United States when I returned home. There was a fearfulness that was xenophobic, or there was a loving place of solidarity. I think 9/11 was the beginning of the great schism we see in our society here 20 years later, of either love or hate. It was pretty distinct in those days as well, and we live with that legacy today. In my tradition, the Episcopal Church, there was St. Paul's Chapel, which was right across the street from the World Trade Center. As recovery work started at the World Trade Center site, hundreds of rescue workers came to Lower Manhattan to search for survivors and begin sorting through the ruins. Slowly at first, rescue workers, police, and firefighters stopped by the chapel to rest and wash up. Because long, exhausting shift prevented many workers from going home, the chapel opened its doors so they could rest. Shortly afterward, an outdoor grill was fired up and volunteers began to serve food to hungry rescue and recovery workers. During all hours, rescue and recovery work staggered through the gates of the chapel. Hungry and weary, weighted down by gear, wearing boots half melted from the fiery ash, they fell into the open embrace of St. Paul's. After working grueling 18-hour shifts at Ground Zero, rescue and recovery workers knew that St. Paul's was the place they could rest for a few hours before returning to the pit. In the first 3 months after September 11th, more than 3,000 workers passed through the gates of that chapel. The recovery workers were changed by what they volunteered to do at Ground Zero, but they were also changed by the ministry offered to them by St. Paul's and its volunteers. At that same time that September 11th was happening, the later Archbishop of Canterbury, who we could say is somewhat the head of the Anglican Communion from my tradition, was in New York at a retreat, He later wrote a book called Writing in the Dust After September 11th. He wrote, "We have something of a freedom to consider whether or not we return to violence, and so in virtue of that very fact are different from those who experience the world, as leaving them no other option. But if we have freedom, it ought to be less likely that we reach for violence as a first resort. The trouble is that this means work of the kind we are very, very less eager for, work that will help us to understand and other, that we begin to find some sense of what they and we together might recognize as good." For me personally, I made a choice, as I knew very little about Islam in those days. I made a choice watching my church open its doors in the heart of New York City to workers. I made a choice of watching society going in two very different directions, that I would learn as much as I could, not just about Islam, but about all world religion, and that I would be a person of deep peace, loving and working and understanding the way forward for all world religions, as I see religion as the solution to these problems of extremism, not the problem itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend George, for those inspiring words. I'd now like to turn to Raju Rajagopal, who is a Hindu American and board member at Hindus for Human Rights. It's a pleasure to have you here today, Raju. How were Hindu Americans impacted by 9/11, and what response did we see?
Thank you. Thank you, Zachary, and greetings, everyone. I'm grateful to ING for organizing this important day of reflection on an event that changed the world in many unexpected ways and has left deep wounds on many communities. Like many other immigrant communities of color, Hindu Americans too saw a significant shift after 9/11 in the attitude of Americans towards immigrants. Example, marked increase in hostile and unfriendly stares in your own neighborhood, occasional cries of "go back home," more incidents of vandalism at Hindu temples, and so on. But having said that, the brunt of the impact was not borne by us Hindus, but by our Sikh and Muslim brothers, as we have already heard. And Gurwin talked about the fury of hate crimes. And last year in 2020, there were 67 reports of bias against Sikhs registered by the FBI, which is a very large number compared to the population of Sikhs in the US. Compare that to 104 incidents of anti-Muslim bias and only 11 anti-Hindu bias. And Sister Ameena has already talked extensively about the impact on Muslims. And the same FBI statistics also shows that what was about 28 incidents of bias before 9/11 spiked, as she said, spiked to more than 400 immediately, but it has remained steadily at about mid-hundreds ever since. That is a matter of serious concern. So I just want to say, basically, as far as America is concerned, it is our Indian American brothers and sisters, Muslims and Sikhs, that paid the heaviest price in terms of what has happened and what is continuing today. But the real impact of 9/11 for me and many in my community was not in America, but in many other Asian countries, including in India. 9/11 and the series of horrific events that followed in the Middle East have been used as justifications by many governments to increase their suppression of Muslim minorities. Notable examples that you're all aware, of course, is the alarming rise in persecution of Uyghurs of China, Rohingyas of Myanmar, especially since 2014. In India, it has allowed the ideology of Hindutva, that is Hindu nationalism, which is based on a foundation of othering Muslims and Christians, to gain ascendancy among India's electorate also since 2014. As a result of their shrewd political calculations and by conflating international events with India's beleaguered minority communities, Hindu nationalists have managed to garner absolute power today. The once renowned secular Indian democracy is fast hurling towards a majoritarian Hindu state, Hindu nation, that is, where the minorities will at best be second-class citizens. In an eerie historical coincidence, it was on 9/11 in the year 1893 that a Hindu monk, Swami Vivekananda, introduced Hinduism to America at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. I'm proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance, he had said in his inaugural address. Some may question today whether Hinduism, with its oppressive caste system as a major marker, can be truly described as tolerant. Nonetheless, going back to Chicago in 1893, he had concluded, "I fervently hope that this convention may be the death knell of all fanaticism, of all persecutions, with the sword or with the pen." Unfortunately, 128 years later, on this 9/11, he would have been surprised to see that those who take his name most often in India are the ones holding the menacing sword and the poison pen today. And this is where, in many ways, 9/11 has meant to many Hindus like myself and many progressive Hindus that are in America today. Where do we go from here? Hindu Americans and the broader Indian Americans community seems to be hopelessly divided between supporters and opponents of the current government in India. We are indeed at a dangerous crossroad, yet we must persist in our engagements, as many of you have already talked about. We must involve the community much more through interfaith forums, and that's one reason I'm here today. We must point out that any community that has benefited from America's welcome of multiculturalism and minority rights should not be seen as supporting another government whose values stand in stark contrast. And finally, we must focus on the youth, who I think have a much better understanding of our constitutional rights, and educate them about the serious jeopardy that the once famous Indian Constitution is in today. Those are some of the things that Hindus for Human Rights, the organization that I represent, are engaged in. We are still a very, very small minority of Indo-Americans here, but with the help of our allyship and partnerships with people like all of you, we hope to grow that voice for peace and dialogue. Thank you very much.
Raju, I so appreciate you expanding our knowledge of the reality of transnational Islamophobia and other forms of discrimination beyond the US, and also reminding us of the history of tolerance from Swami Vivekananda at the Parliament of World Religions over 100 years ago. I'd now like to turn to Devin Matsumoto, who is a Japanese Buddhist American and president of the Young Buddhist Editorial. Devin, how were the Japanese American and Buddhist American communities impacted by 9/11? And in particular, can you discuss the Japanese American response?
Yes, thank you so much again to ING and you, Zachary, for inviting me to speak here. And I just want to say, I do feel a little uncomfortable speaking because I was only 3 or 4 when 9/11 happened, but I'll do my best to share our community's history and story. But I think, that after 9/11, or when any ethnic or minority group or religious group is targeted in the US, it puts every community on edge, whether subconsciously or consciously. We think, when will it be our turn again? Because we know that under white supremacy, none of us are really safe from its violent nature. And I know that I was asked to speak on the contributions of Mike Hahn and Norman Netta, and surely their contributions are significant in advocating for the Muslim community. But I wanted to focus more on a community-based response by Japanese American Buddhist activists. For those familiar with Japanese American history, you would know that during World War II, over 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were incarcerated because we were labeled as the enemy from within by the government, politicians, and white society. What isn't told, however, is that a majority of the Japanese population in the US at the time were followers of various Buddhist traditions. The government saw Buddhism, much like they see Islam now, as a threat to national security. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Buddhist community in the US was under heavy surveillance by the FBI, and a list of our leaders had already been compiled to prepare for mass arrests. Because of this, within hours of Pearl Harbor happening, our community saw our Buddhist priests and temple leaders rounded up and incarcerated. Many Buddhist temples were forced to shut down or were taken over by the US government and the army. And in the incarceration camps, Buddhism was heavily surveilled and at times prohibited. I think that this little part of history is important for us to understand when analyzing the violent aftermath of Pearl Harbor and 9/11, as we see a violent response at the hands of the US government. But now going back to the community response I mentioned before, Japanese American Buddhist temples like the Ascension Buddhist Temple in Los Angeles responded to 9/11 by reaching out to our Muslim neighbors. The head priest there, Reverend Kodani, called the nearby mosque to offer his support, which then began relationship building between Japanese American organizations like NCRR and the Muslim Community Affairs Council. Iftars and obons were observed together, and through this relationship and greater understanding for both communities' histories, a deeper relationship was developed and the roots of solidarity planted between both the Japanese and the Muslim American community. Now, the organization Vigilant Love, which was formed in the response to the San Bernardino attack, has taken the lead in connecting the Japanese and Muslim American experience in LA through their Solidarity Arts Fellowship, which connects young college-aged youth from the Japanese and Muslim American experience, as well as advocating for social radical change. And they do this by different educational opportunities. Most notably right now is understanding the countering violent extremist policies that have come out that target mental health practitioners into helping identify terrorists, which inevitably impact our youth, where we ask mental health practitioners, community leaders to be, in a way, spies in their own communities. But so these are just different ways I see our community reacting to 9/11 by building community with our Muslim cousins and creating lasting relationships that help protect our communities when we're in need. So ultimately, I think that between the Japanese American and Muslim experience, who have seen very similar things at the hands of the U.S. government, it's very important for us to move together to build a community that can support each other in times when the U.S. government has failed to do so. So thank you so much again.
Thank you, Devin, for sharing that eloquent summary of acts of solidarity between expressed from Japanese Americans to Muslim Americans, and also the history of the imprisonment and internment of Japanese Americans. I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, who I've had the pleasure of hearing before. Sheila Dawkins is an African-American social justice organizer. Sheila, can you discuss how African-Americans and people of color in general were impacted by 9/11?
Thank you so much, Zach, and thank you so much, Devin, for sharing about the Japanese experience. Mostly when he mentioned Normanetta and his connection to San Jose, where I live, but and also the similarity in the othering that went on after 9/11 in the African American community, specifically in New York. There was a major push toward profiling and stop and frisk by the then mayor, who was really elevated. The mayor of New York, after the response and so much fear that everyone has spoken about, the mayor was Giuliani, and he was going out of office as mayor, but he stayed in office because of the public outpouring of support during a time when there was just frustration and chaos and just a lack of understanding of what was going on in the moment. And he was in that position of authority. And one of the things that came out of that authority was, like Devin was saying, all communities were really impacted, and specifically the African American community faced a big backlash of stop and frisk. The intensity of the police department just was magnified in communities of color, where they were stopping with no real justification. And African Americans of every age range were stopped on a regular basis, to the point of where young men and young women have PTSD because of that experience of fear of just walking down the street and being basically accosted by police officers for being African American in that space. And so that was a huge backlash to the community. But the community is also wrapped up in the Muslim lens, because of the fact that African Americans have a large degree of Islamic practices and stronghold in our community, from Detroit to New York and beyond, where they have built up the Muslim base. And so they were impacted directly inside of the African American community. And so there was a gathering of support in an interfaith space to support that facet of the community, but also in the press. So the Amsterdam News is the African American newspaper in New York City. And every day, like almost every week, because they're a weekly paper, they would have a little digest of what was going on with the community related to what was going on with the police department and the community as a whole, to make sure that everyone was connected to the ideal of how the community was being impacted. Social justice was elevated in that moment as well, because of the need to push back against the restrictions that were limiting communities of color, and the blatant just disrespect for our elders as well, where there was like no knock warrants were enacted in communities of color at alarming rates. And so it was a very stressful time, but also as that was happening to us, young men and women of color were going overseas to engage with the Afghan and Iraq wars, as was mentioned earlier. And as always, young people of color, and specifically African American, are usually the majority who are sent over in those efforts, and continuously sent over. So many young people of color, and family members of mine included, were sent on multiple tours to Iraq and overseas, as our country was expressing retaliation, but also trying to community build in spaces that were foreign and new to everyone in that space. And so those experiences have had long-term impact, not on just them and their identities, but also on the community as a whole, and the ideal of PTSD and trauma and mental health being layered on top of that. And so all those layers of challenges have happened, but just like everyone was saying, there's also been that support layer that has been also layered on, that has been about healing and has been about adjusting. And so just like we have reentry programs for young men and women who leave the criminal justice system, like when people are coming back to the community, we really try to find ways to support families in those spaces to make sure that they can be able to adjust, because adjustment can be very traumatic, mostly if you went into the war space when you were like 17, 18, and this was your first experience as an adult in a space where you were around violence and around different experiences. And so the ideal of coming back home and being able to re-engage has been something that the whole community has worked in solidarity to support that shift. And so yes, the pain and the stress of 9/11 was heavy on everyone's heart, but specifically in regards to the response on the ground of how it impacted community was huge, and how it continues to impact in terms of some of the voices speaking out today about being labeled a terrorist. Even today, if you look at our activists around Black Lives Matter, they're being labeled terrorists. They're being labeled anti-American because of their willingness to stand up for communities of color to get their justice and equity in terms of the American dream. So the cycle continues, but also the pushback against that cycle is also continuing as folks are joining in solidarity for change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sheila, for lending so much insight into how African Americans were impacted by 9/11. And from what you say, it sounds like every aspect of the aftermath, from the attack itself to attacks on Muslims and hate crimes and immigration. So I'd now like to turn to our next speaker, Felipe Camacho Lavelle, who's an Latinx American and AOL Border Rights Project volunteer. Felipe, thank you for joining us. And I'd like to ask you what everyone else has also addressed. How were Latinx Americans and immigrants affected by 9/11?
Thank you, Zach. And again, thank you, ING, for holding this wonderful panel and for having me here, and to all of the panelists. I am the son of a Mexican father and a Jewish American mother, and I myself was born in Mexico and raised in California, Oakland, California. And my family moved to the US from Mexico City in 1993 when I was 2 years old. I think it's important to note that at the time we moved to the US, the immigration process was much different from what it looks like today in the post-9/11 era. And for the last 2 years, I have volunteered with a legal aid organization, Al Otro Lado, in Tijuana, Mexico, helping migrants and asylum seekers navigate the US asylum law. But jumping back a little bit, I was just shy of 10 years old on September 11, 2001. And what I remember from that time is the activation and mobilization of the community around me to counter the racism and the phobias that we knew would follow towards the Muslim, Arab, South, and West Asian communities in the US and around the world. I remember that the Latinx artist community, which my family is a part of, came out with art and murals and banners and chants, many of which came directly from previous labor movements like the farm workers movement and others. For example, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido, or in English, the people united will never be defeated. And as someone who identifies as Latino or a member of the Latinx community, the militarization of the US in response to 9/11, specifically through law enforcement throughout the country and at the border, has also affected our community. I've witnessed the effects of this firsthand in my time volunteering at the border. And quickly, I want to acknowledge that because Latinx is neither a race nor a religion, there are many people who identify as Latinx who are also members of other identity groups that have been covered by other members of the panel already. But after 9/11, immigration was thrust into being an issue of homeland security, and the people crossing our borders began to be vetted as quote unquote potential threats to national security instead of as people. While the reality is that these are human beings arriving at our border to find what is essentially a military force facing them down. And here, I want to say that we're in the habit in this country of generalizing and stereotyping the kinds of people that arrive at our border. I can't do that. Many people arrive at our border for an incredibly diverse range of reasons. And the only thing I can speak to with certainty is what they arrive to when they do, which is Border Patrol SUVs roaming the landscape behind a see-through wall, helicopters beaming bright lights down at all hours, cameras with a vast range of vision technologies, and the threat of detention in what are colloquially known as either the hielera, or the icebox, or as the perrera, or the dog cage. Images and stories of which we have all likely become familiar with or seen on the news. I've spent hours reminding families with small children to wear their thickest layers underneath because they'll be stripped of everything but, to then be held in a room maintained at about 47 degrees Fahrenheit for an unknown amount of time. And all of this can be linked to the hypervigilance and suspicion of outsiders stemming from our national reaction to 9/11. And like Devin said, this is a reaction that the country had after World War II, after the events at Pearl Harbor, towards Japanese Americans. It's not new, but it's this reaction. But it's not just those who are outside of our borders who have experienced the consequences. Those in the Latinx community who live, work, and exist within US's borders have felt the effects as well. Directly following 9/11, the Homeland Security Act of 2002 condensed several agencies and created the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, as Zach mentioned, or ICE, whose searches for and arrests of immigrants throughout the country, often operating under vastly different and less restrictive rules than those of other policing agencies, has pushed many immigrants into the shadows and cast a sense of fear throughout Latinx communities among many other communities in the US. And even for those who aren't undocumented, there is often a sense that ICE or related agencies pose a threat to them anyway. And examples of this being true include Arizona's Senate Bill 1070, which would have allowed police officers to check for legal immigration status during any lawful stop, and the fact that many police departments across the country have working agreements with ICE. One quick example hits a little closer to home for me, is of the CBP officer, the Customs and Border Protection officer in Montana, who a place that I called home for more than 3 years, who detained 2 women for merely speaking Spanish in a gas station. And of course, we have more social effects, consequences like the El Paso Walmart shooting, wherein a man armed with an assault rifle murdered 23 human beings, claiming that he was acting in response to a quote unquote Hispanic invasion. And I know I just said a lot, but these experiences of both the Latinx folks arriving at the US border, as well as those existing within these borders, are a direct result, and there's a direct line to be drawn from the nation's militarization in response to the events of 9/11. But although many of these effects of that militarization have been negative, as I experienced as a child here in Oakland, and as many of the panelists have already spoken about, I think just as powerful of an effect and a response has been the many, many people throughout a diverse range of communities coming together in consistent and beautiful displays of solidarity and unity. The organization that I've had the pleasure to volunteer with at the border has been working to challenge the policies and laws to make sure that human rights and asylum rights are upheld. So I think those are very beautiful responses.
Thank you so much, Felipe. What you say, I think, resonates deeply with the 2 themes that we've raised, and also Reverend George, on the one response of fear, xenophobia, and isolation, and the other of love and solidarity. And your work certainly, and all of our panelists remind us of the latter. And I'd also like to add that another of our speakers, who unfortunately was unable to join us today, Shannon Rivers, representing Indigenous peoples, was going to speak on how Indigenous communities were affected in similar ways to what Felipe describes, especially those living near or on the border. I'd like to turn now to Daisy Kim, who's an Asian American and Asian American Studies and Race and Cultural Studies educator. Daisy, thank you so much for joining us today to share your knowledge and experience. How were Asian American communities impacted by 9/11?
Hi, Zach and everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you so much for sharing all of your respective stories and stories of your communities. Today, I want to share how 9/11 has fundamentally changed and affected the Asian American community. But before I get into that topic, I want to highlight how the term Asian American is a very broad term applied to so many different groups of Asian immigrants within the United States. So it includes the South Asian community, the Southeast Asian community, East Asian community, and so forth. And given the diversity of it all, actually a percentage of South Asian and Southeast Asian are Muslims. And given that context, I feel like 9/11 affected different parts of the Asian American community differently. Oh, and of course, the Pacific Islander American community. But because the Asian American community, as defined by the census, is so broad, and so many different parts of that community or affected by it differently, I'll try to cover as much of it as I can, and also start by giving a bit of my personal story and how 9/11 has impacted me, and how it's really become a way to observe and understand what citizenship in the United States means, whether it affects Muslim Americans, Asian Americans, and whatnot, and how fragile this notion of citizenship is for a lot of communities of color and just immigrant communities. So when 9/11 happened, I was in high school and I had no idea what was going on, but my history teacher at the time brought out the TV VCR machine, and my initial instinct was excitement, because usually that meant that they were just going to make us watch a video for the day. And soon enough, I realized we were watching the news, watching 9/11 unfold, not sure, if it's fact or fiction. At the time, I had come to the United States as a preteen. I immigrated here when I was about 12 with a family sponsorship, but I had yet to be part of the green card application process. So what then happened after 9/11 is that with the introduction of the Patriot Act and all these different immigration policy changes, a lot of the paperwork got pushed back by years. So then a lot of people lost their path to legal citizenship. And a lot of members of the Asian American community, actually right after the Latinx community, it's the Asian American community that have the highest number of undocumented immigrants. So we, as a community, a lot of people fell under that and realized that 9/11, even though it was an attack on the US, but it also then became a secondary attack on their path towards citizenship. And also, similar to what Sheila was saying, it became an issue where law enforcement officers could and did continually harass, immigrant groups for papers, demanding to check for their status on whether they belonged in this country or not. And it also created a long-term limbo where we now understand as the DREAM Act and DACA, where it took over a decade for a lot of people in the undocumented and immigrant communities to understand how and what and how 9/11 impacted immigrants and immigration policy in the US. So it delayed a lot of the efforts and the effects that were foundational to introducing and pushing the DREAM Act and other immigration policies forward. So in that sense, 9/11 affected the Asian American community to be more reflective on how that impacted their status in the country. And it also made the Asian American community more reflective, because a lot of our own history is based on this idea of being otherized and not being considered a citizen and being considered an other or a threat within the country, even though you are a citizen. So Devin brought it up earlier about the Japanese American internment camps and how after the bombings of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans got targeted and profiled. But even before that, Asian American history almost starts with this idea of exclusion. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, where Chinese Americans were the first to then be excluded based on their ethnic and immigrant background, to be denied citizenship, denied entry into the United States, and from obtaining citizenship. So the Asian American community has a long history where citizenship has always been denied or been made difficult. So 9/11 definitely became a very reflective and turning point. But on one hand, it allowed opportunity for different types of community building between the Asian American and Muslim groups and other immigrant groups and other POC groups, where they started different grassroots organizing, I would say, after 9/11. So an example would be the Japanese American Citizens League would organize sort of this walk, or they shuttle Muslim and Japanese American community groups to shuttle to an area, then walk to Manzanar collectively, so that they can then understand and reflect and break bread and build community together on the shared experiences between the groups. So I would say a lot of growth has also come since 9/11 within the Asian American community, with coalition building and just growth within. So with that, I'd like to end it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daisy, also for sharing your knowledge and experiences. And I think from these discussions, from what all of you were saying, it's, racism and xenophobia, especially coming from white supremacists, but also systemically, it's of the same species. And right now we're seeing an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans because of COVID. And I think all of us, Muslim Americans, Sikh Americans, certainly African Americans can sympathize, and we stand with you. I would now like to open up the floor to all of our panelists to discuss, and some of you already have, what lessons you have learned and what recommendations you might have for the audience. How do we constructively address the bigotry that we saw and continue to see in the aftermath of 9/11 with meaningful action? So if anyone would like to volunteer a response, please feel welcome to chime in or raise your hand.
I'll go ahead and jump in, if that's okay. So I think a number of speakers have really emphasized the importance of allyship and solidarity, especially during a time of crisis. And I have the utmost respect for people who are not personally under threat, but who actually put themselves out there for a community that they're not part of. That's truly remarkable. And we've heard all the mentions of the Japanese American community, supporting them because of their experience there. In particular, as was mentioned, Norm Mineta, who was the Secretary of Transportation at the time, actually sending a letter to all the airlines forbidding them from practicing racial profiling. And he said that the reason he did that is based on his own experience. So a lot of times this allyship is based on an intersectionality that comes from shared experiences. And then of course here in the Bay Area, former Congressman Mike Honda, who also stood up for Muslims. He actually told Muslims not to change their name or their identity following the attacks. He actually spoke at a Muslim convention immediately after the 9/11 attacks. And he also stood up for then Representative-elect Keith Ellison, who wanted to use the Quran in his swearing-in ceremony, and said, that nobody should be labeled un-American based on their religion, and that's un-American itself. So putting yourself out there when you're not required to, that goes beyond the call of duty. And those interfaith allies, whether these particular people in high positions or just your neighbors, standing up for their Muslim neighbors, protecting women hijab, guarding mosques, all of those things, if you are a marginalized community, the most important thing is to feel secure in your own town. And it is that security that makes you able to sleep at night. And so for many Muslim Americans who are not really involved in interfaith engagement before 9/11, but today, according to our recent poll, 60 to 70% of mosques are now engaged in interfaith work. I think that is incredible, and it shows the power of allyship. And here at ING, we've been working with people of other faiths for a long, long time as you know, the Interfaith Speakers Bureau, which for me, even personally, I thought myself to be, you know, very enlightened and very, you know, engaged. And yet I've learned so much every time I do a panel, every time I, you know, have a conversation, I learn something both about my own faith, about myself, as well as about others. And the same thing with the Intercultural Speakers Bureau, which really shows the striking similarities. And so one of the things that, you know, we really invite our listeners to do is to join these bureaus, to access our resources. We have so many resources, including about Islamophobia, answers to questions about Islam and Muslims, and many other curricula. And so that is, you know, one way to really show allyship, is to learn more about each other and to stand up for each other in times of need.
Thank you so much, Ameena. I'd now like to invite Rabbi Melanie to respond to the question.
I'm just going to jump on what Ameena said about Mike Honda, because I recall him coming within a week after 9/11 to encourage us to continue our Arab-Jewish dialogue group. And he came and sat with us for the afternoon to make sure that we didn't despair and that we continued meeting. And I think that kind of support was very important. Also, I think it was Reverend George who said something about how the divisions we experience today aren't new, but really go back to this period of 2001. We often talk about the past president giving permission to bigotry, but it did really begin in 2001. Unfortunately, you know, kind of lifting the rock and allowing all of these other people to come out. Alternative facts isn't just a new thing. It, you know, began with talking about weapons of mass destruction when they knew there was no evidence of that. So in a lot of ways, the issues of the past have come home to roost. And really, the only thing we can do is to band together to address all of these different issues, and to do it as a coordinated community, all of us working together. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Melanie. I'd now like to turn to Raju again. Please feel welcome. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I talked about how some of us who label ourselves progressive Hindus are a very small minority in the community. And when you are so small and dealing with a much larger force, allyship becomes even more important. And one of the things we have learned is to get off the kind of insular, introverted view of the Hindu community, to start making more inroads and more allies, and particularly with African-American community who are, of course, on a long term bearing the brunt of bias and bigotry. And we made a small start that I just wanted to share in participating in the Selma Bridge Crossing Jubilee last year, where we brought back the interactions between Martin Luther King and Gandhi's legacy, to remind the world that while the civil rights movement here learned a lot from Gandhi's nonviolence movement, today it's the civil rights movement here that needs to help out India to save its democracy. So these are the kinds of topics that we are engaging in, so that we feel that broader allyship and shared values will help us grow, not with more Hindus on our side necessarily, but more Americans of different faiths. So that's the lesson I've learned, and that's the path we are on.
Thank you so much, Raju. And I'll just add that we at ING are inspired by the legacy of Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And so often folks don't know, because of media representations of Muslims, that there are also nonviolent Muslims throughout history, but including in the present and in the 20th century, Abdul Ghaffar Khan in India and Pakistan, and who worked closely with Gandhi, and Ahmadou Bamba in Senegal. But now I'd like to turn to Reverend George to answer this question.
So I've been thinking a lot about the fact that as I heard everyone speak, I was just overwhelmed by the level of xenophobia and racism that reared its ugly head after 9/11, and how very different my experience was as a white Christian American. And I guess what I want to say to teachers listening and to those out there who are white American, Christian American like myself, part of the dominant culture, how important it is to listen and to hear the experience of people in minority communities and to stand with them as best you can, and to really listen first and ask questions about their experiences and to learn as much as we can from each other. It has been such a rich experience for me to learn from my colleagues at ING and to be on these panel conversations, to learn about Islam, to learn about the experience of Asian cultures and other cultures. So I think that that's first and foremost, and the way we need to proceed forward is by being the best ally we can, means listening first. So I'm grateful to all the panelists tonight for talking about their experiences and learning from them tonight.
Thank you, Reverend George. And now I'll turn to Daisy Kim. How do we constructively address the bigotry and racism that we saw and see in the aftermath of 9/11?
I feel like after 9/11, the term racial profiling and hate crimes became almost like an everyday word, and it got introduced to our lives as something almost normal. But even before that, I think it was, Raju that brought up the aspect of like during Martin Luther King and Gandhi, like throughout history, whether it was like during the civil rights movement, the key words that were introduced became like segregation, racism. And because so much of American history as it exists is rooted in white supremacy, and that hasn't changed. It's just that I feel like every few decades, we're just introducing new words, right? To call out what's happening and to describe what's happening. And I feel like what 9/11 did was such a big, profound moment where it then introduced racial profiling and hate crimes. And 20 years later, I think at least in the Asian American community, we're seeing such a huge surge of that happening and affecting us in our communities now, that we're really understanding how everything is truly connected. It's cyclical. So then it just comes down to how do we then continue to fight against white supremacy. And I'm just so glad that, as we're sitting here with all these different panelists and different educators on board, just collaborating and discussing, figuring out what to do next. I just wanted to point out also that I was so just relieved, excited, grateful, and all that when ING first reached out to me during the pandemic to bring me on board, because within the Asian American community, we talk about hate crimes constantly because it's been on the rise at like 200, 600% more than it used to be pre-pandemic, that there are other organizations and communities out there that acknowledge and are willing to give space and to continue working together to eradicate and work against white supremacy. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And want to thank everyone for continuing to add on to this community, to this dialogue. And I can't wait to learn more from everyone.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Thank you all so much for these very thoughtful recommendations, and just your talks in general were all some of them very heartbreaking, but I think constructive and moving us from that space of fear into one of love and solidarity. I'd like to invite teachers, students in our audience to view ING's webpage on resources to supplement a lesson plan about 9/11. To view these resources, please see the Zoom chat for the link or visit ing.org/resources-FOR-teaching-about-9-11 /. You can also simply search for the page at ing.org. The website includes our statement on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, articles with questions by Muslim Americans on the impact of 9/11 for grades 7 through 12, a video and article developed by Dr. Amara DeCure and the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University on culturally responsive teaching for 9/11 commemorative lessons, ways for educators to schedule free talks or panels for their classes with speakers from our Islamic Speakers Bureau who speak on various topics related to Islam and Muslims, and our Interfaith Speakers Bureau who present on various topics related to 5 major world religions: Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism, and our Intercultural Speakers Bureau, who address racism and how to counter it from the perspectives of Americans of African, Asian, Latinx, Indigenous peoples, Muslim, and Jewish backgrounds, which is very similar to what you've seen today. We also have cultural diversity seminars for professionals in education, businesses, healthcare, and law enforcement on Islamophobia and how to deal sensitively and appropriately with Muslim Americans. The ING webpage also has free online curricula for educators. It has our recent and upcoming training webinars for educators on teaching about world religions in schools, bullying prevention, and religious discrimination in schools. Finally, we will present the video of this 9/11 panel discussion on the webpage. We invite educators to view the recording of this panel discussion with their classes, discuss how various religious, racial, and ethnic communities were impacted by 9/11, and what recommendations you found helpful. Teachers can also ask students to write about how particular communities or someone they know were affected by 9/11. ING will also present a lesson plan with guiding questions for teachers and students that can be used in classrooms after viewing this panel discussion. We at ING believe that education and engagement with the narratives of others are among the best ways to achieve peace. It may be possible to transform the pain and trauma of so many into mutual understanding and empathy. Thank you to all of our panelists for offering us visions based upon love and solidarity. We are grateful for all that you've shared with us today. It's our hope that all of us can learn from the insights you shared and continue to come together when any of our communities are in need of support. I would also like to thank all of my colleagues at ING for making this event possible, especially Bay Area Director Ishaq Patan and our founder and Chief Innovation Officer Maha El Junaidi, whose vision inspired this panel and all the work that we do. On behalf of our speakers and everyone at ING, thank you for sharing your time and attention with us.